We will wrap this unit on pro-social versus antisocial behaviors in Chapter 10 as we cover the topic of prejudice. And this is a very, complex and deeply rooted social phenomenon that has had far-reaching consequences for individuals and societies as a whole. Prejudice is defined as a preconceived opinion or feeling, either favorable or unfavorable. In the context of social psychology, we're primarily concerned with negative prejudices, those that are based on a person's membership in a particular social group. And so these prejudices can manifest in a variety of ways, including stereotypes, discrimination, and even violence. And so in this lecture, we'll explore the nature of prejudice, its causes, consequences, and we'll also discuss strategies for reducing prejudice. And so our goal for this lecture isn't just to define terms, but to understand the why and how behind prejudice. We'll explore its components, that's the thoughts, which are stereotypes, feelings, prejudice itself, and the actions, which is discrimination. We'll uncover how seemingly normal mental processes like categorization lay the groundwork for bias. Furthermore, we'll examine the real-world consequences, such as how stereotypes can actually hinder performance. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we'll discuss evidence-based strategies for mitigating prejudice both in ourselves and in society. So let's go ahead and start by getting a clear definition on what we mean when we talk about prejudice and the challenges that researchers face in studying it. So think of it this way. Prejudice is the overall negative attitude toward members of a distinguishable group based solely on their membership in that group. The cognitive component, individual involving the beliefs or thoughts, which again are those cognitions, make up the attitudes, which again are the stereotypes. Any sort of belief that we associate with the group, for instance, just saying like all X are or whatever Z, right? And these can seem positive, maybe like Asians are really good at math, but they're still generalizations. And so even if we don't believe these stereotypes, we can easily recognize them as a common belief held by others, reinforced by things like social learning, culture and social norms, language, biases, and imbalances of power. The affective or emotional components can represent emotions linked with the feelings, such as anger or warmth. But for prejudice, there are more likely the other extremes, such as mild uneasiness or outright hostility and even hate. Now, behavioral components relate to one's actions. People don't simply just hold attitudes, they usually act on them as well. And so discrimination is the action, treating someone differently because they belong to that group. And researchers sometimes view stereotypes and discrimination as parts of prejudice. Others see them as three interconnected aspects of our attitude towards groups different from our own. The thinking part, which are stereotypes, the feeling part, which is prejudice, and of course the doing part, which is discrimination. And of course, both views acknowledge the strong links between these concepts. For our discussion, we'll mostly use the umbrella term approach, but it's good to be aware of both perspectives. Walter Lippmann, a distinguished American writer, reporter, and political commentator who was first to introduce the concept of the Cold War, also coined the term stereotype in his 1922 book, Public Opinion. He described the distinction between the world out there and stereotypes as the little pictures we carry around inside our heads that we use to make sense of the world around us. Lippmann has been regarded as the most influential journalist of the 20th century, as well as the father of modern journalism. So, if prejudice involves negative feelings and beliefs, how do researchers accurately measure it, especially when people might not want to admit their biases? Well, measuring prejudice isn't straightforward. If I ask you directly, are you prejudiced against Group X? Social pressure might lead you to say no, even if you feel some sort of discomfort. And this is the social desirability bias at play. Sometimes participants try to guess the study's purpose and give the quote unquote right answer, and this is known as demand characteristics. For instance, imagine a study on religious tolerance. People might overstate their acceptance, assuming that's what's expected of them to answer. Perhaps the biggest challenge is implicit prejudice. And these are the biases that we hold unconsciously. Think of someone who makes consistently sexist remarks but insists that they respect women. They might genuinely believe it, but their unconscious attitudes are different. And so we've just defined implicit prejudice. Again, these biases that we might hold without even realizing it. It can be hard to grasp how these unconscious attitudes affect us, but they can have real consequences. And so this video from 100 Humans uses a shooting simulation to demonstrate how implicit biases might influence split-second decisions. And so feel free to take a look at this video, the link will be shared, and put these concepts into your mind. And so this activity in the video speaks to the unconscious biases in a number of ways. First, the experiment shows that even people who are aware of and opposed to prejudice can still have implicit biases. And this is because implicit biases are unconscious and automatic. They're learned over time through our experiences and interactions with the world around us. Second, the experiment shows that implicit biases can have a real impact on our behavior. And so in the experiment, the participants were more likely to shoot the unarmed black targets than unarmed white targets, even when they were explicitly instructed to shoot only armed targets. And this shows that our implicit biases can override our conscious intention sometimes. Nobody wants. Now, seeing results like those in this 100 humans simulation underscores why it's so important for researchers to try and understand and quantify prejudice and bias. If these attitudes can have real-world consequences, we need reliable ways to study them. So let's now turn to how psychologists attempt to do this. One clever approach is to shift from asking about feelings to asking about potential behaviors. Instead of asking, how do you feel about group X? Ask something like, how likely are you to invite someone from group X over to your house for dinner? And researchers also directly observe behaviors, kind of like in the video. So remember that TV show, ABC's What Would You Do, starring John Quinones? In the show, they staged a bike theft with actors of different races and genders. And people said they'd react the same way regardless of the thief's race, but their actions showed clear biases. Actions definitely speak louder than words here. And a major tool developed in recent decades is the implicit association test, or the IAT. And this is a psychological tool designed to measure implicit biases or unconscious attitudes and beliefs that individuals may hold. It was developed by psychologists Anthony Greenwald and Masarin Banaji, and the IAT is often used to assess associations between different concepts, such as race, gender, or other social groups, and various attributes or social stereotypes. And so it measures how quickly you associate group labels like black, white, male, or female with other words that are either positive or negative. And the idea is that faster pairing reflects stronger, often unconscious associations. So if you consistently pair group X with negative words faster than with positive words, it might suggest an implicit bias, even if you explicitly deny it. And so here you can take a look at the application of the implicit association test. This particular video is called, Do You Have a Racial Bias? And so after watching, the IAT has been influential, but it's not without debate. Though the IAT has been praised for revealing biases people don't report explicitly, especially on sensitive topics like race, critics raise important questions. Some researchers reanalyze data and argue the link between IAT scores and actual discriminatory actions isn't as strong as claimed. Initially, a big plus was the belief that you couldn't easily fake your automatic reactions. However, there's a debate about whether people can intentionally skew their results. While some argue faking is detectable, the possibility still raises concerns. Nonetheless, it is a tool. And although it's unclear whether the IAT is really measuring unconscious prejudices, the developers of this research are driven by great purpose. Given these challenges, when and how might prejudice actually reveal itself? Because even the most quote unquote unprejudiced person can behave in a prejudiced way under certain circumstances. Modern racism is the prejudice revealed in subtle, indirect ways because people have learned to hide their prejudiced attitudes. Basically, modern racism is characterized by a veil of concealment, where individuals may harbor prejudiced attitudes while outwardly presenting themselves as unprejudiced. So, as the norm swings towards tolerance, many people simply become more careful, outwardly acting unprejudiced yet inwardly maintaining stereotype views. And this type of racism manifests when people display outwardly unprejudiced behavior while internally maintaining prejudiced attitudes. The contradiction between actions and attitudes creates a complex dynamic. So, understanding the disparity between outward actions and internal attitudes is crucial for addressing modern racism and fostering genuine inclusivity. Individuals have also learned to hide their prejudice strategically, particularly in situations where expressing such biases is socially unacceptable. However, when the environment becomes perceived as quote unquote safe, these concealed prejudices may surface. But note, recognizing the selective disclosure of prejudice does shed light on the importance of creating inclusive spaces where individuals feel safe to express their true beliefs without fear of judgment. And sometimes specific situations act as triggers that can reveal underlying attitudes or prejudices, especially when social norms discourage openly stating those biases. People might express socially acceptable views in general, but their reactions in a particular context can show something different. And so, a classic example of this involves research on attitudes towards school busing for desegregation. While polling might show many white Americans at the time agreed with the principle of desegregation, the specific situation of implementing interracial busing often triggered a strong opposition from white parents regarding their own children. So now, when questioned the stated reason for this opposition, it was always some sort of practical response. So, concerns about travel time, safety, or the inconvenience of just busing itself. Parents often explicitly denied the prejudice ever played any role. But here's where the specific situation does become revealing. Researcher John McConaughey, back in 1981, examined this closely. He found that many of the same white parents who were vehemently opposed to interracial busing were actually quite calm about busing when it simply involved transporting their children between different predominantly white schools or even over similar distances. And so the strong, vigorous opposition was triggered specifically by the situation involving interracial busing. And this comparison strongly suggests that the racial component of the situation, not merely the practical aspect of busing, was the key factor in eliciting the negative reaction. And in this case, the specific situation acted as the trigger, revealing the underlying racial attitudes and biases that contradicted the parents' stated non-prejudice justifications. Now, when prejudices are revealed, they often manifest as what? Discrimination. And so discrimination manifests in behaviors that result in unequal or unfair treatment of individuals or groups. And this can occur in various settings, including workplaces, educational institutions, housing, public spaces, and social interactions. It often involves denying certain opportunities, privileges, or rights to individuals based on their characteristics. And this can include barriers to employment, restricted access to education, limited housing options, or exclusion from social activities. Discrimination can lead to the segregation or separation of individuals or groups based on their characteristics. And this may involve physical separation in public spaces, institutional policies that reinforce segregation, or exclusion from certain social or professional circles. And so these discriminatory behaviors can also manifest as harassment, including verbal, physical, or online harassment. And such harassment obviously creates a hostile environment and can be detrimental and have negative effects on well-being and mental health of those that are targeted. Now, it's not always limited to individual actions. It can be embedded in institutional policies and practices leading to systemic discrimination. And so this systemic discrimination perpetuates unequal treatment on a larger scale, affecting entire communities or demographic groups. It can also be reflected in biased decision-making processes, and this includes hiring practices, unequal allocation of resources, and the uneven application of rules and regulations. And there's also challenges with things like subtle and often unintentional discriminatory behaviors that are known as microaggressions. These contribute to the overall experience of discrimination. And of course, they can be verbal or nonverbal and convey derogatory messages based on the individual's characteristics. And of course, in extreme cases, it can escalate to violence and hate crimes. Hate-motivated actions involve intentionally causing harm to individuals or property based on prejudice or bias against a particular group. And so as we recap section 1, we've learned that prejudice is a multifaceted and negative attitude toward a group encompassing our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Measuring it accurately is tricky because people might hide their true feelings or not even be aware of their own biases. And researchers use behavioral measures and tools like the IAT to get closer to these underlying attitudes. But these methods also have nuances and ongoing debates. And so the behavioral manifestation of prejudice is discrimination, and that encompasses unfair treatment and systematic inequalities based on individuals' characteristics that manifest through biased decisions, segregation, harassment, and in extreme cases, violence and hate crimes. In section 2, we'll explore where it comes from. Is it purely learned, as some early quotes suggest, or are there deeper roots to prejudice?